understanding the full value of nature is pretty critical. I think we've all been talking about that today. In particular, in city regions like Montreal, Toronto, Halifax, in Nova Scotia, we've lost much of our nature in our cities. There's still quite a bit surrounding our cities, but it's slowly disappearing too, including farmland. And really, when we think about climate change, some would say that cities have the most to lose by not having nature around and the most to gain by having nature around. And that with what we're seeing with climate change and weather events these days, that it's really urgent for everyone to act. So I think it's great that Ontario is here in Montreal, in Quebec, and we're meeting to talk about this together, because I know we need to get out of our city region and start talking to other city regions across Canada.
It's working.
Okay, great.
Yeah, thank you. There's sound to it.
Okay. No, there's no sound. So there's no sound to this. This is a history of development and environmental protection in Ontario since 1945. So you will see that's Toronto. It grows bigger. That is the Niagara Escarpment, which is a big geological cliff that runs through the region. Then you see the Oak Ridges Moraine that came out in light green, that is full of headwaters of 65 rivers that basically supply water to 6.5 million residents in the region. And then the last bit of green, or another 500,000 acres bit of green that you see in the end here, is farmland that was then added to this protection. As in red, the cities grew around the region, and that is now all called the Greenbelt. The Niagara Escarpment, the Oak Ridges Moraine, and then the protected farmland is now all called the Greenbelt in Ontario. Okay, so now how do I get out of the video? And I think I do it this way. Yeah, there. Great. So, Greenbelts, it's a land use policy in Ontario. So it is protected. The Greenbelt, its boundary is protected in provincial policy, and it basically tells municipalities where they're allowed to grow from an urban expansion point of view and where they are not allowed to grow. So you can't have urban expansion into the Greenbelt. And the Greenbelt itself is made up of farmland, major water resources, and a connected natural heritage system, and then multiple rural communities. So it's also protects the rural economy, both the agricultural economy, so it protects soils, but the agricultural economy and the rural economy. And the reason it does this is because, of all the environmental benefits and the economic benefits to that for the region. There are two in Ontario, as I think you both know, one in Ottawa and one in the Toronto region. The Ottawa Greenbelt is about 50,000 acres, and the Toronto Greenbelt is 2 million acres. Half of that, or almost half of that, is farmland. It is one of the biggest greenbelts in the world, if not the biggest of its type in the world. And it really stands out as an example of a regional protection of natural assets. So I'll show you a map that shows you all the cities surrounding the Greenbelt, south of the Greenbelt and north of the Greenbelt. And so the Greenbelt itself, the protected space, is the jurisdiction of multiple municipalities. But because it's provincial legislation, municipalities all have the same protection in their backyard. And so even though your municipality may only protect, 200,000 acres of the Greenbelt, your residents will get the benefits of all 2 million acres of the Greenbelt when it comes to clean water supplies, local food, and nature benefits like cooling from the forests. And that's, that's an interesting frame, I think, for how cities kind of tackle the future, both from growth and from climate change. So in this presentation today, we're going to look at how we value this asset for the region, and then we're also going to look at how, so from a natural capital point of view, but then we're also going to look at how municipalities can start investing in the Greenbelt to improve its ecological services, a lot of what you've been talking about today. So there's a particular pilot program that we want to talk about that we're doing with municipalities. David Suzuki Foundation is part of that pilot program, and then there's some other major projects we have underway that also do that. So this is just a big picture of the region. The Greenbelt, of course, is this part of it. Comes down into here. But all this up here just gives you an idea of the nature, and over here, of the nature, the natural connections that are still around this Greenbelt, this protected space. So these other areas aren't necessarily protected, although there's quite a few provincial parks in these areas. But for a region in Canada that is very urban, there are still, although it's disappearing, tremendous ecological connections on a really wide landscape. And we know that, from Montreal to Windsor, so to the American border, Detroit, that we all live in the mixed wood plain ecozone, so it's very rich in biodiversity, right? It's got lots of endangered species, probably because it is so urbanized, and it's got very similar topography, so a lot of rolling hills and plains, both in Montreal and in the Toronto region. We've got a lot of abundant availability of water and some river valleys in our areas. We've got prominent physical features from glaciers like Mount Royal and the Niagara Escarpment in our region. We both have some of the best agricultural soils in the country. The same kind of summers, wet and warm, same kind of winters, cool and snowy, although I think you guys have more cool and snowy and we have more wet and warm. I might change. And we both are, in zones where the weather changes rapidly. With or without climate change, we're in zones where the weather just changes rapidly. So there's a lot of similarities between our regions and what we're actually trying to protect here. In agriculture too, we're very familiar with the predominance of Quebec agriculture and the importance of that economy to Quebec. In Ontario and even in the Greenbelt region, around all of those cities, there's still quite a bit of farming that goes on. And we've got the Holland Marsh within the Greenbelt, which is really Ontario's vegetable basket. So it grows a lot of carrots. In fact, you guys might even eat those carrots here. It grows a lot of celery and lettuce. And then we've also got the tender fruit and grape lands in Niagara, so wine. It's coming along. The wine's pretty good. And a lot of stone fruits like pears and peaches, etc. So the other thing about this landscape is it transitions to the boreal shield, so the Canadian shield. So that makes it these external connections to this island of green. It's very important that we look at the bigger picture of connectivity and see what we can do with others in the region to make sure that these natural landscapes are actually protected. So this in yellow are the cities. Mostly the big cities are in gray. Down below here, so Toronto, Mississauga, Oakville, Ajax, Pickering. But you still have Hamilton over here, which is a growing city and unfortunately sprawling. And you've got the Niagara region over here, and then quite a bit of development you'll see in these gray areas. This is Waterloo and Guelph region, and Barrie is a smaller city, sort of up in the Lake Simcoe area. There's quite a few little towns out and above here that are growing. So these are outside the Greenbelt, but this is where the province is designated, urban growth. Not all of it, but that's where urban growth is happening. And there is a provincial policy that governs urban growth in this entire yellow region, so that it's trying to control sprawl, basically, and to get cities to grow up and intensify versus expanding out. And if anyone's been to the region in the last 20 years, you can really see that it's expanded. It's out further and further, and it's causing a lot of traffic congestion, etc. So this area is 70% of Ontario's population. And it's 25% of the country's population. It's the economic engine of the province, and some would say the country, and it certainly has a lot of job creation in it. Some of this land, that we see, so all the land in gray is built on. The yellow land is not built on yet, but some of this land, when it comes up for sale down in this area, just outside the Greenbelt, acreage sells for $90,000 to $100,000 an acre. So that's the kind of development pressure that we deal with, and I'm sure there are similar development pressures happening here. I can see it from this pretty fabulous building. So at the moment, there are 9 million people that live in this region, and by the year 2041, it will grow to 13.5 million. Not sure we'll hit that mark, but that was projected. So nature's going to need to work pretty hard to resist being turned into housing in this region, with both population growth and just the market of land. And, as I said, most to gain, most to lose. So a little closer look at the Greenbelt map is right here. It's 12 years old. It's extremely popular piece of government legislation. 9 out of 10 residents in this region support the Greenbelt, and that support is pretty clear. When there's ever been any talk about taking land out of the Greenbelt, the public reacts quite strongly against that happening. The Greenbelt includes a lot of public, but mostly private land inside its boundaries. So when it comes to looking at protecting or improving, increasing ecological services, it's knowing that we'll be doing that with the support, having to have tools that help us partner with private landowners. Now, the reason this kind of came about is in the 1980s, the Niagara Escarpment, it's rock, basically, and it gets, you guys should go, it gets beautiful up here, really high cliffs. This is really cold, deep, gorgeous water. This is really shallow, warm water, so you can just cross the street, and it's quite lovely in the summertime. But in the 70s and 80s, the aggregate industry was mining this, and it was blowing some pretty big holes in the cliff, and so the public got a little bit outraged because it's just such a defining feature on the landscape. And so the Niagara Escarpment was protected in the 80s. And then this area here is the Oak Ridges Moraine, so it is really a gigantic aquifer that plenishes all the rivers and this part of Lake Ontario with good, clean water. And in the 30s and 40s, they put a lot of money into reforesting the Oak Ridges Moraine because the rivers were becoming polluted from sedimentation, et cetera. And then in the 90s, there was a big battle to just protect it from urban development because houses were being built and it was losing its permeability So it was going to be losing the amount of water that was going into the Oak Ridges Moraine that would feed all these river systems. So in 2001, the government protected the Oak Ridges Moraine because of that region, and then the rest of its farmland that was protected in 2005. And that was because there was just, all of a sudden, there was just like rapid loss of farmland in the area. It recently has grown to include some of the river valleys. They're not great protections for the river valleys, but it's kind of symbolic because 20 of them run through our cities now, and we can say that's the Greenbelt, which is kind of nice. Okay. Those are the urban river valleys. So Friends of the Greenbelt Foundation, that's who I work for. I've been there for a while now. Our current focus, this is recent, is to really spend a lot of time on building the Greenbelt as a resilient piece of infrastructure for the region as it grows from a population perspective and because of climate change. And then the second part of that story is that it is also a working landscape. There are rural communities, there is an agricultural industry there, and so we help support that. So in the last 10 years, we've really valued economically kind of the Greenbelt as a working landscape. Traditional economic and job benefits associated with agriculture, outdoor recreation and tourism that's based on nature, like hiking and cycling. And we valued that at $9.2 billion inside the Greenbelt, 160,000 jobs. We've invested in our money in sort of building a local food system, linking up hiking trails in the region, creating a 500-kilometer cycle route. Again, you should come. You guys like to cycle, but it really goes from here it's the way through. And this is the Oak Ridges Moraine, so you're just like this on your bike. It's kind of fun. And then when you come in around the Niagara Escarpment over here, you're kind of going like this. It's more like dramatic up, down, instead of rolling hills. But you end in wine country, so it's quite lovely. We come here and bike. So now, though, in moving forward, we're going to also be paying a lot more attention to this part of the equation and recognizing the return on investments on this side are really built on having quality soils, having quality nature, and having a water supply. So we're spending time now kind of looking at measuring that and then investing in those assets of water, soil, and nature. So that's our logical next step. We've been doing some work in it for the past couple of years, but it's a logical next step. So we want to measure and invest in the Greenbelt's natural assets. And our goal is really to protect and enhance nature, but also to stop its destruction and attract investment. I think we're all starving for money to enhance nature, and looking for innovative ways and the green infrastructure argument to really bring money to the table, much of what we've already heard today. The other thing we're going to be talking about is understanding, just the consequences of paving over or our water recharge lands and our natural heritage. What just the cost from a service that is to us, and that's something that is starting to happen a lot within municipalities and the public as they're really starting to talk about that. And we see in Ontario that the public really understands. Because they've acted 3 times now, to say, yes, we need development, but we also have to protect nature, or our community and quality of life is going to suffer from that. So the public really gets this stuff, I find. So we've done some work on the measurement, and I will go over this. Our current measurement, we did a report, the David Suzuki Foundation did a report for us in 2008 that looked at sort of intermediate services like water filtration that you get when you value forests and wetlands. And it really helped us, kind of focus attention on the greenbelt and natural assets. This latest report here looks at valuing benefits to the end user of protecting nature. So what is your benefit? What is my benefit? What is industry's benefit when we actually protect nature? So instead of saying, wetlands are worth $14,000 an acre and providing water filtration services, we can say, that hiking is worth, is a $280 million benefit, to residents in the region. And I'll explain that a bit more going forward. And then the second part is to get at how we invest. Oh yeah, thanks.
Sorry.
So I'm getting over
It's not subtle, but
I'm getting over a cold. So the second part of our work is looking at how do we improve those services to the end user. So great, we've got a protected greenbelt. It gives us great natural asset services, but how do we get superior ecosystem services out of the greenbelt? Okay. So nature in the greenbelt, about 730,000 hectares. A lot of that is farmland, as you can see. A lot of it, significant portion of it, is forested land. Wetlands, 100,000 hectares in the greenbelt. This would be almost 8,000 hectares of hedgerows. This would be sort of your scenic cliff values. This is alvars, which is a rare ecosystem in the greenbelt that we have 212 hectares of. So then we look at who benefits from that nature. And we looked at population within 20 kilometers of the greenbelt boundary. And we looked at, age, right? So who can access those services, that nature, and the services it provides. And we looked at the number of households. So there's about 3 million households in this region that live within 20 kilometers of the greenbelt. And what we looked at was, there's 3 different categories of services that those landscapes fall under: aquatic, terrestrial, and atmospheric. And I'll go through sort of what the accounts actually were that we identified, but they add up to $3.2 billion worth of ecosystem services to the region. So we looked at recreation services, existence, scenic services, extractive uses, like water, for example, protection of human property, flooding, plant cultivation or pollination, that supports growing crops, and clean air. And that's how we came up with the $3.2 billion value. So, the clean water supply under extractive use and some other extractive uses are worth $370 million each year to the region. Flood protection is worth $224 million to the region. Pollinators are worth, $48 million to agriculture, to plant cultivation in the region. So it really kind of helps break it down so that we can talk to residents, we can talk to counselors, we can talk to farmers, in a way that's very specific about how it benefits them. And these are some of the Recreation was the biggest. That came out with the biggest number. I think it was, yeah, that's, 2 billion right there, right? So recreation that depends on nature in the Greenbelt is really important for rural communities and the viability of and the future of those rural communities. Oh, that's just some of the numbers. Let me get through that. This person would be on top of the Niagara Escarpment, see what I tell you? And how much just having those scenic views is worth to us. Some of the extractive uses, so water supply, crop irrigation, maple syrup. Yours would be Quebec's would be much larger. Flood protection, this was modeled. Support for human health was modeled, so we looked at pollution to calculate this value. And then if you add up all of the benefits to agriculture beyond just pollinators and plant cultivation, this was the full ecosystem benefit provided to agriculture in the Greenbelt, over $56 million. So we have a whole report on this with an appendix that really goes in to the methodology that was used in the report. One thing that we were also very interested in, as everybody is carbon sequestration. Now this would be more of sort of an intermediate service calculation on carbon stores and sequestration. So it does show that with the farmland and with the forests and the wetlands in the Greenbelt, that really there's a reason, even though, most governments, when they look at carbon sequestration, they're looking at vast forested lands in sort of northern Ontario, northern Canada, other parts of the world, the boreal forest in Canada. Well, I think, many people also think that there's a good reason to look locally too, right? To smaller landscapes that especially if they're protected or there's good policy around them, that if you invest in those carbon sinks, they can have still a lot of payback, even though they may not be as big. So, what are we kind of using this study to do? So we're going to use this study as a background to track changes. Recreation participation is probably going to increase, so those natural assets are going to become more important. The wetland restoration, is it taking place on the landscape? Are we losing, are wetlands becoming degraded? Carbon storage, etc. And we're also going to look at more assets and more services. So more data to evaluate over time, because we tried to look at 100 different data sets, and we could only come up with data for about 65 of them. So there is more work to be done just in the methodology of this report. But it does, well, you can read it, but it does use a lot of new methodology around calculating ecosystem services that has improved over the last 10 years, even though we're still sort of looking for some data. And then we want to make this data available so that you can even do sort of smaller scale assessments for whatever purpose that you want to, and it's also a great way to communicate with different stakeholders around the Greenbelt. We use these stats all the time, and it's really also when we talk about reasons to keep investing in kind of those traditional economies, like I talked about, agriculture and nature-based recreation, these stats really, really work. Okay, so now the second thing is investing in natural capital. So it's great. It's great to value it. how do we use those valuations to actually attract investments in nature going forward, new ways to attract investments in nature going forward. And we strictly look at natural assets, so aquifers, wetlands, forests, parks, lakes, rivers, creeks, fields, soil, not engineered assets. So we're not looking at bioswales, for example, just because of what the Greenbelt is. And we look both inside the Greenbelt and outside the Greenbelt at the larger region, because we feel like you need to kind of mainstream the practice, so you have to go with and talk to the people that are ready to go, right, that are most interested. And so we work both inside and outside the Greenbelt on those natural assets within our city region. One thing we're doing right now is a restoration plan for the Greenbelt that, and this is sort of one way that we're looking at raising some funds is to do a large restoration plan for the entire landscape. And so we looked at we're working with conservation authorities to look at, they looked at 4 different improvements they wanted to make on the landscape: connectivity, habitat improvement, water quality and quantity, and then climate change, like carbon sequestration and flood control. They have a series, there's over 100 projects that are going to cost about $1 million over the next 10 or 20 years. And these are the project types. But what we're doing with the Greenbelt Restoration Plan is, instead of talking about these individual projects in individual municipalities, we're creating one story, a unified story about the whole. If you plant forests in one region, it has an effect across the entire region. So we're trying to create a better value proposition for investments, new investments in natural heritage, by having a much bigger story to tell, and a story that's going to impact residents across the whole region. So we can talk about those 9 million residences versus the 100,000 in one municipality's backyard. And so this has not been launched yet. We're working on getting all that together over the next 4 months. Key components of this plan are going to be branding the Greenbelt as a natural asset. We're doing some business cases that, we're taking a couple of the really big projects around reducing temperatures in cold water streams by removing dams, etc., creating new green space, putting in new wetlands. We're doing some ecosystem service calculations so that we can show specific returns on environments for specific projects, some of the bigger ones. And we're going to use that in our fundraising pitches to whoever we ask money for. We're also trying to shore up some agricultural leadership so that agriculture is at the table and they're defining the type of ecological enhancements that both help farming, but that they would also be doing on their farmland, because there's so much of it in the region. And then we're putting together a communication plan for the region. Another project that we've been involved in and been funding is, one sec. So, I should say, when we talk about sort of the communication activities on our restoration plan, we'll be talking about the Greenbelt as a natural asset versus the fact that the Greenbelt is kind of degraded in spots. We're actually not going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about if you put your money into the Greenbelt, you're going to increase crop production. You're going to reduce flooding. You're going to increase the value of nature-based economies. You're going to get some new green space. It's that kind of language very positive language around investing in the environment. So, municipal natural assets. So this is a really interesting project. It's pretty new, and it's certainly leading edge. What it is a turnkey program for municipal governments to take their natural assets, their wetlands, their forests in their backyard, and value them, and then plan for them financially inside their existing infrastructure programs. So inside their existing asset management programs. So when you're a municipality and you have your asset plan for sewage pipes in the region, or perhaps a better example would be for stormwater conveyance in the region, so stormwater control in the region, that you may have some pipes in that asset management plan, but you've also got some wetlands and some forests and some grasslands in that asset management program inside your municipality. And the reason for doing that is really so that, one, these assets are valued, so there's less chance of a municipality perhaps allowing building on those assets or development on those assets. But it also really helps municipalities financially. It's going to, because they are much lower costs, which we'll go through, and they're much more durable in extreme weather events than gray infrastructure is. And they can handle, a wider variety. They're much more flexible in the different magnitudes of storm events that can be handled. So there's, not necessarily the same, limits as a size of a pipe would have. So there's some pilots happening across the country. We've got 3 pilots happening in our city region, and we're about to start a few more in the new year. And I want to go through some of the examples of what's actually happening. All of them are focused on stormwater management and flood protection, just because that's what municipalities in Ontario seem to be the most concerned about at this moment in time. So a real bonus of this program is it doesn't set up a new program for municipalities. We're not asking municipalities to do anything different than they already do in asset management. So this is the BC Asset Management Program. It's not specific to natural assets, but the project has found a way to incorporate natural assets into this asset management framework, assessing, assets that are needed and the value of those assets, planning for those assets, and then implementing them, i.e. paying for them. And I should mention, MNAI, this is something that we fund, right? This is their program, the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, and it's a coalition of David Suzuki Foundation. Their environmental economist is part of this. Smart Prosperity is part of this. They're out of Ottawa, and the town of Gibsons in BC is part of this because they're the first ones in the country to do it, and a few others. So I'll go straight to a couple of examples. So one example is the region of Peel. So what they did was they wanted to understand the stormwater services provided by natural assets in their region. So the region of Peel goes through 3 different municipalities. It's a river system, the Credit River, that goes through 3 different municipalities. So they chose to look at all the wetlands, all the forests and woodlands, and all the open space in their jurisdiction, and they wanted to know if they disappeared, what would it cost to replace them with an engineered stormwater infrastructure to get the same service. So what they had to do was, they had to calculate what services they were getting from existing wetlands, forests, and green space, and then they had to calculate the replacement costs. And they did it under existing conditions, and then they did it under future climate change conditions using the year 2065. And here's what they found, which is really interesting. So total value is, they did business cases for rural and urban. And what they found was that there wasn't a lot of difference between the value of the systems from existing to the climate change scenario, which means these systems do well under climate change. They don't use their value, they don't lose their value. And that was probably one of the most valuable things that the government learned when they did this scenario. And that's very attractive to municipal governments that are so worried about their infrastructure. I won't tell you about the one of Oakville, but if you go on to the MNAI website, which is just mnai.ca, it will have all of these examples on it. The city of Oakville is really interesting because it's right downtown in an old neighborhood, and it's using old remnant streams, both on private property and on public property, as green infrastructure in their municipality. I'll lastly just touch on municipal finances. So, why are municipalities, and in our region, they're really interested in this project and being involved, and we're trying to figure out how to make things happen faster. They like it because, first of all, it just saves municipalities money. There's often no startup costs, right? When you're bringing a wetland or a forest into your asset management program. So there's no barrier there. From an operating and maintenance cost, to improve, make sure that the asset is functioning to a high quality, it's really an investment in the future. And there's really no end of life costs. You don't have to rip out a pipe, right? It's there. So there's tremendous cost savings for municipalities. But what it also does, it opens up new revenue streams. So municipalities can look at user fees, they can look at stormwater utility charges. There's even some work that's being done on development charges where eligible development charges, you can define some of the natural assets that are delivering services for new developments, right? You can define them, and the town of Gibsons in British Columbia successfully has done this as an eligible expenditure under development charges. And so they're able to get development charges to sink into their natural assets, which is very cool. And also the federal provincial infrastructure funds. Again, the town of Gibsons has gotten some federal infrastructure dollars for taking a stormwater pond and naturalizing stormwater ponds, right, and doing some studies to see how best to accomplish that. So it's really about taking natural assets, internalizing them in the everyday business of a municipality, and starting to get money invested in these natural assets every year, ongoing, and saving the municipality money while doing it. So it's really in the early, MNAI is really in the early stages, but there's a lot of interest in it. From a financial planning point of view, just very quickly, some people will say, oh, it's not in the public standards accounting handbook, but there are conversations with the standards people, and there's also some things you can do as a municipality to get around that right now, just around basic financial planning and recording what these assets are, sort of their location, their size, their service, and we think that change will eventually come from the standards, because there's a lot of interest, even from insurance industry, right, to really kind of push this. So what's next with us on this? Fundraise for the Greenbelt Restoration Plan, to mainstream this MNAI practice with municipalities, and then we want to explore additional investment opportunities for natural assets, and we're looking at, as I said, carbon sequestration, local carbon sequestration and offset programs, so that funding is coming locally versus not just elsewhere. And then we want to work with partners in Canada that are very similar to the situation that we're in. Thank you.
a des questions pour Madame Petrie?
I have one, actually.
Sure.
I'll ask it in French and you tell me if. Pour ce qui est de la ceinture verte, je sais qu'il y a eu beaucoup de pression. Il y a des fois eu des critiques qui ont associé la ceinture verte au prix de l'immobilier très, très élevé dans la région de Toronto. How do you respond to those critics? Or I know your new premier was talking about a few months ago, talking about dismantling the Greenbelt and it didn't go well for him. That's good news. les citoyens ont vraiment critiqué quand Doug Ford a voulu réouvrir au développement des parties de la ceinture verte. But mostly, how do you react when critics say it had an impact on raising the cost of rent and home value?
It doesn't. And that's before the current government got elected, there was about a 2-year debate in Ontario about whether the Greenbelt was, causing the rise of housing pricing. Banks, the previous provincial government, the federal government, many others, looked at what was causing housing prices to rise and where were housing prices rising. And it had nothing to do with the Greenbelt. In fact, there is tons of land. There is decades worth of land to build out from Toronto before you ever hit the Greenbelt. The reason why it keeps getting talked about, I hate to say it, but it is a campaign by by a portion of the development industry, not even the entire development industry, right? But unfortunately, in the region, there's sort of different types of developers. Those that develop intensive in inner cities, and they develop, mid-rise and towers. And then there's developers that develop on greenfields, on new greenfields, and they develop single-family homes, some townhouses, etc. And they're really, pushing municipalities to expand out because that gives them more greenfield. And so we need development companies that are more flexible in what they actually build, and that is going to take some time because in the past they've never had to do that, right? They could build one thing and still make a lot of money building that one thing, and they are being asked to do more now because the Greenbelt's there to protect nature and agricultural land, but it's there to curb sprawl too. That was one of the reasons why the government put it in because sprawl is causing a lot of problems and taking a toll on our economy in this region and the quality of life in this region. They were really wanting to curb it. They did a really good job. Things are turning where the cities around, not just Toronto, but cities in the area are starting to build more compact cities. But this new government, not sure. They I think they get that, but I think they also are still think that greenfield development. They want both. And I don't think you can have both because we don't need that much. We need a lot of housing, but not that much housing. And once you keep putting greenfield into your municipal boundary, it seems to get built on before the downtown gets built on, right? And so it's a pretty big concern. We think we're going to lose actually. What the government did, the provincial government, is they took the Greenbelt and they did a map in the region of a connected natural heritage system across the region and it was the first time, an agricultural system, a map of the agricultural system. Where's the best lands? Where are the businesses that support agriculture? And they said, okay, we want to protect these too, not inside the Greenbelt, but we want municipalities to protect these zones. I have a feeling that's going to disappear. Yeah, I have a feeling that's just going to become development, and there's some big developments that had been planned for some of those agricultural areas that have been recently zoned, and I have a feeling they're going to be allowed to be built, whether they're needed to be built in that location or not. So it's kind of getting back to, yes, you can build. There's lots of land. It's where do we build and how do we build?
Merci beaucoup.